So, welcome everyone to this fourth live episode of Swift Community. This evening, my guest is Dave Verwer. Welcome, Dave. Thank you for
Hi,
joining.
Vincent. How you doing?
I'm doing fine, and you?
Doing all right, thank you.
Perfect. So, as you can imagine, well, Dave, you are the maintainer of iOS Dev Weekly. So, we are going to speak about the iOS community, how it has evolved, and how we can keep up with it.
Of
Um,
course.
Before I launch the episode, just want to remind people who are watching that we are live, and the entire interesting part of live is that you can ask questions in the chat and we can answer them live. So if there is anything that you want to ask Dave, or if you want to react to what we are saying, please say it in the chat and then we'll try to answer your question as best as we can. And that being said, well, I think we can get started. So first section for this episode, it's a section that I think I have all the time now. It's a section about your background, Dave. So can you tell us a little bit, basically, how you got started with iOS development?
Sure. So I've been doing iOS development really since the very beginning. I was a Windows and a .NET developer for many years, and I finally took the plunge and bought a Mac in 2006, and that was my first. That was my first kind of entry into really. I'd had an iPod before that, but that was really the first Apple product that I'd owned, and um, so in 2006, I bought this Mac, and I was doing some web development with it. And I thought, oh, I wonder what this, Cocoa development is. And so I started to, of course, at the time in 2006, there was no iPhone. So I started to learn Objective-C and Cocoa development just for curiosity, really. Started writing a Mac app. And then the iPhone came out, a year later, and then the SDK came out like 2 years later. And really, as soon as that happened, I thought, well, this is clearly something that I'm not only very passionate about, but is a good thing to kind of get myself into. And so I started writing iPhone apps at that point. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense, and it's true that we tend to forget, but the iOS SDK, it's over 10 years old now, so it's been a decade. So quite a lot of things have happened since then, and so we know that one of your activities is to curate iOS Dev Weekly. But what are you doing besides that?
So iOS Dev Weekly is definitely like a constant background task in my week. I'm not writing it all week, but I'm constantly keeping abreast of kind of what's happening in the community and what's kind of going on, and I'm having like ideas about what am I going to write about this Friday, because obviously the links that I put in each issue come from the community, but I also try and write some stuff myself every week. And one thing about it being like a weekly newsletter, and like a newsletter as in focused on the news and the current situation, is that there's very little preparation I can do in advance. So effectively, every Friday after I publish an issue, I've got nothing prepared for next week, and that's kind of good in some ways, and can be a little bit scary in other ways, because am I going to have some ideas of what to write about next week? Probably,
Yeah,
but
when there is a deadline, like you
yeah,
need to
maybe
meet the
not.
deadline every week.
I've just before we started this thing tonight, I've just finished writing tomorrow's introduction comment. So tomorrow's is done. Like I'm happy. We definitely have an introduction comment for tomorrow.
Perfect. Yes. So apparently I had some issues on my mic. I hope it is fixed. Um,
Okay.
okay.
And then so obviously this is like iOS Dev Weekly is like this constant thing. Like but I'm not working on it all the time. So I also do the Swift Package Index is another project of mine. So I run that along with someone else called Sven, who is, and we work on that together. And that's an open source project for finding and getting information about Swift packages that are compatible with the Swift package manager.
Awesome. And
Then I've got some other kind of community sites. So I run a site called iOS Dev Directory. iOS Dev Jobs is another one that I work on. They don't take up a lot of time, but they are kind of ongoing kind of maintenance of those. And then occasionally I also do some client work. That's there's no client work this year intentionally because I'm focusing on the Swift package index, but I also do client work sometimes.
yeah, I think it's very interesting what you're saying, that it's kind of a low key effort to run these things like continuously, basically. And so you've spoken about iOS Dev Weekly and Swift package index. The project I want to focus on first, so it's iOS Dev Weekly, and it's actually the reason why I wanted to have you for this episode is because iOS Dev Weekly has reached a very important milestone 1 or 2 weeks ago, because you issued the 500th issue of the newsletter. So that's a big
I
milestone.
hadn't noticed.
Congratulations.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, it was a number that was on the horizon for a long time, and you think about it in terms of like 500 issues, and when I started thinking about like, well, should I celebrate it or should I do something for it, at around about kind of maybe issue 480 or something like that. But actually, that's still 20 weeks away from
So
500.
half a year almost.
Yeah, exactly. So it felt very close for a long time. In the 90s, 490 something is still 10 weeks away from it. But yeah, it was a milestone, and certainly doing something 500 times takes a little bit of commitment to kind of press that button every week. So it was lovely to reach that milestone, and I got such amazing feedback, and people said really nice things about it, which is lovely.
Yeah, and I must say, like, when I saw a tweet, I was like, oh yes. I mean, I knew that it was there for a long time, but I didn't click that it's been there for, I guess, like 10 years. So yeah,
Almost.
I
Yeah.
get why people must have been like, wow, yeah, this is impressive. So I wanted to ask you basically, like, iOS Dev Weekly, how did it start? First, when did it start and how did it start?
So it started in August 2011. So coming up this August will be 10 years. But of course, because the years are slightly longer than 50 weeks, where there's a little bit of a gap between 500 and the 10th anniversary. Why did I start it? So I was enjoying similar styled newsletters on different topics. That there was a newsletter called, well, still is, it's still going, called Ruby Weekly, which I was reading at the time because I was doing Ruby development as well, and I really enjoyed this kind of weekly dose of just what's going on in the community. And so I looked for one around iOS development because I was interested in subscribing to one, and there wasn't one. So I thought, well, I wonder if I could be the person who runs this. And
Makes
then
sense, yeah.
within a week, I was pressing send on the first issue. It all came together very quickly. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the great thing with the internet, is that it's actually surprisingly easy to set up and bootstrap a project and give it a try and see what happens. And so,
Yeah, I created a MailChimp account and wrote some words and pressed send.
and then the good feedback happened, and 10 years after, we are here talking about it.
That's right. Yeah.
And so we sent me some screenshot of iOS Dev Weekly. So it's what it looked like on the first issues. I guess we see like is it like the iPad 2 or the iPad Mini, maybe?
I think
Something
it was
like
an.
this.
I think maybe it was an iPad Mini. I don't remember which one it was. But yes, it was Apple's stock artwork. A screenshot of mail with my email in it, and that was the website. I think before I launched it, that I couldn't find a screenshot of before I launched it. But before I launched it, it was literally just a email sign up box, and that was it.
Yeah, and I think it's a great feedback for anyone who wants to give a try to something. Is that you don't need to have something very fancy to get started. You can get started with something like very small. Some people call this an MVP, and then you build on it. But it's always better to ship something and try out something than spend months preparing and never doing the thing.
I couldn't agree more. I think that is actually a philosophy that I use throughout my career. Like I'd rather try something, let it fail, and try something else than and find the little successes where they come than really think, well, this is a great idea. I'm going to push this until it works. That's not what I tend to do.
Yeah, and plus often, like most of the time, like what we could call success, it tends like to happen where we don't expect it anyway. So giving
Well,
things
I
a
think that
try.
happened with iOS Dev Weekly, actually. I didn't have any grand plan for iOS Dev Weekly to become anything big. I enjoyed this style of newsletter. I wondered if I could do it. I certainly didn't have any expectations that it would ever make money or anything like that. You know, I started it purely for the purpose of just producing the newsletter. So yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a great advice. Like when you start something, sometimes having big expectations, it can be like not a bad thing, but a little bit like it's going to push you in a direction where you're not going to like grow and develop your concept enough. You're going to start something, focus very fast, and you're not going like to explore all the possible ideas.
And I would say the first couple of years of iOS Dev Weekly, I was doing it entirely in spare time because I was still working on everything else as a full-time job to keep the company going.
That makes
Um,
sense.
and so iOS Dev Weekly was evenings and yeah, like
And I
took
think
some late nights.
I have some other screenshots of how things have evolved. So yeah, this is maybe a little bit after we can see the date. So 2012. So a few years after issue 32. So we're still in the first year, I guess, at that time.
Yep.
So yeah, and let's
Yeah,
see
so
like
that was the template. And as you can see, like it was super, super simple template. No colors, no fancy fonts, nothing. And that actually, like that was fine. I don't feel bad about this. It was that template did exactly the job that it was intended to do, which is get the words across in an efficient way, let people read it, and yeah, it was a very simple template, and the email looked very much like that at the time as well.
but I think like still today the template there are some colors, but also it has this feeling of being like very simple, and it
Yeah,
conveys the message that the content is the important part.
there are there are no almost no images ever in an iOS Dev Weekly.
That's true.
That's not what it's about. It's about just here is the links for the week, and here are some words written by me.
So let me like show some other screenshots that I have. So here we are a little bit after, so issue 80. So we are 1 week, 1 year after. We can see like you've introduced two ways to subscribe. So there is the email and there is also the push notification.
So this was a design that was brief. It was briefly across the website and the email, but it didn't last very long because something happened around this time, which is I at the time I was still sending all this through MailChimp, and I'd written myself a couple of little tools to help me gather some links and to create like a markdown document out of. I used, do you know the site Pinboard for link collection?
I
Uh,
don't think, but yeah,
it's
I see the idea and I see the purpose like
Pinboard.
to store some links. Yeah.
Yeah, pinboard.in, I think is the URL. So I was collecting links using Pinboard, and then I wrote a little script which grabbed all the links out of Pinboard and made a markdown document out of the titles and stuff like that. And then that went through through using another tool that I wrote into MailChimp to generate the template and stuff. So, but I thought, well, it's making a little bit of money now through sponsorship. I wonder if I should actually put some development time into building a tool to help me send this newsletter. And so that became a tool that only I ever used. And it was around about this time that was happening. But while we were building that tool, and at the time I had a small company with a few people employed, so we were working on this together. And while we were doing that, I did think, well, I wonder if there might be a product idea in this. I didn't build the product straight away. I wanted to build the tool for me first, because I think that's how you might end up with something that actually solves a problem. Is I had a problem to solve. I was spending a lot of time every week putting this newsletter together. And so I built the tool first of all for me, but with an eye to kind of, well, maybe somebody else might one day want to send a newsletter using this tool. So yeah, and we transitioned across to sending it through that tool, and then decided, okay, well, yeah, let's turn it into a product, and that became a product called Curated, which is still running today. I'm no longer involved with that product. We built it, ran it for several years. It became successful, and then that product got acquired by another company, and so another company run it now, although I still use it as a customer.
Yeah, and I want to speak a bit about curated because so I took a look at the website of the product. I've like saved some of the GIF and we're going to show
Mhm.
them on the screen. But I really like the functional scope, and it's true that when you see it, you really understand that this tool has been like tailor made for your use cases. So I'm going to display the GIF, and I think you can like explain what are the features of this product. So first GIF.
So yeah, so it basically has the whole cycle of producing a newsletter like this in it. Everything from collecting the links and storing them. So as I come across something during the week, I never try and remember to collect something. I just instantly stick it straight in Curated. And then it's all there waiting for me on Friday. Friday comes and I'll normally have between maybe 40 and 50 saved links at that point, and I start to write the newsletter from that.
Okay, so that's very interesting. So during the week, whenever you see something interesting, you click on the button on your browser, so you save it in curated, and you wait actually until Friday to really like use the compose part of the tool, like composing the newsletter. And
Yeah.
so to compose the newsletter, so here is the corresponding picture.
Yeah, so you end up with the kind of list of potential links on. I actually tend to bring everything in so that my newsletter is full of 50 things, and then I figure out what I want to write about, and I write my little paragraph underneath each one, and then after I've written an appropriate number of those, I think, well, how's it looking? Do I need a couple more? Do I need a couple less? And maybe I'll cut a couple or add a couple more, and go from there. Yeah.
Yeah, so you've composed the newsletter, then so you need to publish it. So you have this tool which seems like also like give you some kind of preview, also add the metadata, that kind of thing.
Yeah, you can get a preview of it at any point, and you can send a preview email to yourself, or to a preview tool or something like that. Yeah.
And then we have all of the features that are useful after you send the email. So the analytics, for instance, so to have the data about who opened the newsletter, I guess, how many people clicked on the link. And
Absolutely. Yeah.
and finally, there is the one feature I wouldn't have expected to find in such a product, but it makes sense when you think about it. So you also have a way to deal and to book sponsorships also built in into the tool.
Yeah, so it's limited functionality there. It's really for scheduling sponsorship. So keeping a track of who has sponsored and making sure that that link actually gets inserted into the newsletter, because, yeah, you don't want to do that.
Yeah, and I really like this idea of like you started something. It started very small, then it grew. Then like you're a software developer, so you made tools, and then it evolved into a product that in the end like got acquired. Think it's super interesting, but also it shows like how like really when you do things like gradually, well, one step after the other, you end up in the end with something that makes a lot of sense and solve some real issues. Uh, and also, I think you sent me some screenshot of what it looks like curated when you use it. So yeah, the way that you use it, the back office, how it looks like.
So that's actually a screenshot of potential links for tomorrow.
So maybe tomorrow we're going to hear about AltConf or things like that. Okay, so this is all the links that you have collected during this week. And then
So far, well, I haven't actually. So it's one job after we do this tonight is for me to read my RSS tonight. So I haven't actually collected everything yet.
and I think we're going to speak about the RSS part just a little bit later because I see the screenshots like on my own back office. And if I display, yeah, and so this part, I guess it's when you actually like write the paragraph in the newsletter.
Yeah, so the editor for each of the articles, each of the paragraphs below each article is just a piece of Markdown. So I write the Markdown directly in there. And one of the hard things, and one of the reasons this product was successful, is that creating a newsletter using the same style of template every week is actually quite a tricky task. And what I wanted to do was completely remove anything to do with formatting out of the way of me writing every week. And so, and of course, I mean, I think most people who will be listening to this, Markdown is a very natural language to, or markup language to write in. You just effectively just write. And so I wanted, from the beginning, I wanted it to be a Markdown system where I didn't have to worry about ever what color, what font something was. Just here's the text, here's the links, here's occasional bits of formatting like bold or italic.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that part. And so curated, I think the link is in the description of the video, and I can really like encourage the audience to go check it out because I really enjoyed like the way it's been built. And if you're interested in kind of like how to build a product, I think it's something that yeah that you definitely want to see. And so we've just spoke about keeping up with the community. So that was the next part I wanted to talk about is because well, when you make a newsletter, as you said, every Friday you have a deadline. You must share some interesting content, and so you must keep up to date with what's happening in the community. And of course, I wanted to ask you, well, how are you doing it? What are your best practices for this topic?
Yeah, I mean, this has changed a lot over the years, really. You're right that it's kind of good to have a deadline. It's good to have a deadline because it focuses the mind, and you I definitely feel that like it's a constant. It keeps it constant in my mind of like, okay, I've got to be thinking about what I'm going to be talking about this Friday, and that's just become part of my life. But the other part of it is keeping up with what other people are doing, and the biggest thing that the biggest place that I get all of my information from about what the community is doing is RSS feeds. It used to be RSS and Twitter, but I'm happy to say actually that people have really like there is a little bit of a resurrection of RSS at the moment, and like people do still tweet their articles, blog posts when they write them. And of course, that's good, and that's how they should do. People should do that, but that's not the best way to keep a kind of a look at the whole community, because who is a completionist on Twitter anymore? It's not really a possible position to take anymore. Certainly not for me. I couldn't follow everybody in the community, and even if I did, I definitely couldn't read everything that everyone writes on Twitter because it's chaotic. You can't catch everything. So RSS is my big thing. And again, over the years, that process has changed. You know, when I first started, I just had my own little list of RSS feeds that I was subscribed to, just from like I was already subscribed to a whole load of people's RSS feeds. And so over the years, I added to that, and I started to keep a slightly more organized list of things, but it was still just my list. It was just in my RSS reader, and I would read it every week. But then a few years ago now, I decided that I wanted to give a little bit more structure to how I discovered feeds. The way that I tended to discover feeds is I'd find somebody on Twitter normally, and then I'd go and have a look if they had a blog, and if they had a blog, I'd go and add it to my RSS reader. And so I decided to make that, I basically decided to crowdsource my RSS subscriptions. So I made a site called iOS Dev Directory, which I think you have a screenshot of if you want to
I
check
have a
that out.
screenshot. There is also the link in the description if people want to check it out. But iOS Dev Directory is this one.
Yeah. So this is a site that I put together that basically I generated this site from my RSS feeds originally to seed it with a whole load of data. But then I asked people to contribute their sites if they were writing something about iOS development. And this, for the last few years, has been constantly evolving list of blogs and feeds and people writing about iOS, which is fantastic. And not only do I subscribe to that, but anybody can subscribe to this. So the site publishes OPML files, which are lists of subscriptions that you can, OPML is a generic format that can be used for lots of things. But one use of an OPML file is to contain a list of subscriptions that you could add into an RSS reader. So you could grab these links of RSS feeds from here and import them into any RSS reader, and then you'd also be subscribed to the same source material that I am.
So that's a takeaway to take from what you said, is that anyone can add something to iOS Dev Directory. So if you have a blog or anything, like if you make any content that is related to iOS, well, after you watch this interview, you can definitely click on the link in the description and go add your content to iOS Dev Directory. Actually, I know that this channel, I have added it to iOS Dev Directory when I started, because you reminded me that it was important to do it. And so this is the kind of information that you can find.
And it's been a constant. It's been something that I constantly work on to get people to add that. So I have a suggestion form on the iOS Dev Weekly site where people can submit a link if they would like a link to be considered. And for years, every time somebody submitted a link, if they submitted a link and the site that they were submitting was not in the directory, I would either just add it myself, or I would email them back and I would say, would you consider adding your site to the directory? Here it is. Here's how to add your site. And that's actually now become an automated process. So I recently redid the submission form for submitting a link to iOS Dev Weekly. And as part of it, it asks you a question. It says, is this a link to a blog? And if you say yes, then it pops up a little thing within the form that says, "Oh, you should add your blog to the iOS Dev Directory to save me a little bit of email every week."
Yeah, and as you can see, so here is what you get when you click on iOS development blogs, and what you can see is that here it's only the A letter, so there are a lot of blogs there. So definitely, also if you want to learn something, if you want to find new places to learn stuff, you can definitely head to iOS Dev Directory, and you're sure to find a lot of content, definitely more than what you can read anyways.
Yeah, I've just loaded up the site now, and it says the number at the top. So I think there's currently 815 sites on there. So if you do subscribe to those OpenML files, be prepared for there's some reading to do every week.
But it shows how active is the iOS community. That's a great figure to have. And I think you've also sent me this screenshot of InnoReader. So I guess it's your RSS reader.
Yes, well, there's a couple. It's a rather convoluted RSS process that I go through. So there's a service called InnoReader, which is a web service, and InnoReader is the only RSS service that I know of that can subscribe to an OPML file. So you can subscribe to an RSS feed, but this service will subscribe to an OPML file. So whenever somebody adds a blog to the directory, the OPML files on the directory automatically get updated, and my InnoReader subscription notices that OPML file changes and automatically subscribes me to that feed. So it is impossible for me to forget to subscribe to a feed that's on the directory. Because if you're on the directory, I am reading the things that you write every single week. So, and then but InnoReader, I mean, it has a web interface for reading, but it's It's not amazing to read in. I like to read my RSS through an app called Reader, Reeder. And so this is Reader synced to my InnoReader account again, and this is what I'll be doing straight after the show tonight.
Yeah, and I really like this way of doing things. I must say, like, I'm not a big user of RSS feeds. I'm most like the kind of people that spend their life on Twitter. But I think like maybe like during the week of WWDC, I'm going to give it a try and try to load your file in InnoReader just to get an idea of everything that gets published during this like very like busy week for the iOS community. I think that's a
So,
good idea just to get a sense of it.
so let me tell you why I love RSS. If if somebody starts a blog and they add it to the directory, or I just subscribe to it, or anyone subscribes to it. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, we are live. These kind of things. That's the kind of thing that
Yeah,
happens.
like, let me switch Do Not Disturb on. Sorry about that. Do Not Disturb. Okay, sorry about that. So yeah, where was I? If you subscribe to an RSS feed, then that person stops blogging, or they stop updating their site, they stop writing on their site. That's okay, because once you've got that subscription, whenever they choose to write another blog post in the future, you will automatically get that brought to you. And so it's a great way to keep track of a lot of different people that are not necessarily blogging every single week. And that's fine. Like, it's not necessary to blog every single week. It's okay to blog when you actually have something to say. And so what I love about RSS is it allows you to keep track of a really, really big group of people that are publishing occasionally. And that way you really get, like, I would rather listen to something that someone's been thinking about for a couple of months more than somebody who kind of publishes every day. Like, how many unique thoughts have you had since yesterday
Yeah.
compared to how many unique thoughts have you had over the last 3 months that maybe have matured into something that actually a bit more significant? Yeah.
Yeah, that's very true. It's true that social network they tend like to amplify a small group of people, but of course, if you want to get like a large picture or to find like some really interesting articles that no one has yet found, definitely like it makes sense that RSS is a tool that is much better suited for the task. And
Yeah.
and so, still speaking about the community, after how to keep up with it, I wanted to ask you, since you've been covering, we could say, the iOS community for something close to a decade, how the community has evolved over these decades. So, do you remember like maybe some like big milestones or how things like were when it started with iOS?
Yeah. I mean, it has changed a lot. I think at the beginning of when iOS was like brand new, um, there was a really big kind of gold rush into, like, suddenly there's this app store and people are making millions of dollars on this app store. And what that did was attracted a huge number of developers to rush into this platform and say, okay, well, if anyone's making a load of money off it, I can make a load of money off it as well. And people did. But what it did was it changed quite fundamentally and very quickly. It changed how the community felt, because for years Mac developers had been this kind of little niche segment of the development community. They'd been off to one side, not really in the mainstream. You know, the Mac it always had a good user base, but in terms of, thinking back 15 years ago, 20 years ago, it was never anywhere near as big as Windows at the time. It was a niche. And it had this really amazing community of very passionate people that cared deeply, deeply, deeply about that platform and writing software for that platform. And suddenly, from nowhere, came an enormous influx of developers that didn't care about the Mac. That in some cases had never used a Mac, and in some cases had no interest in a Mac. But suddenly, Objective-C and the iOS SDK had all these new people kind of coming in and developing with it. And that had positives and it had negatives. And actually, I think one of the things that I didn't enjoy seeing at first was it created quite a big rift between like Mac developers and iOS developers, and that faded over time, and everyone kind of everyone kind of got on with it eventually. But it did kind of cause this kind of little bit of a split between Mac and iOS development at the very beginning. But what it did do was it injected an enormous number of new people into that Objective C community, and suddenly, when I first started writing Mac software, it was difficult to find, for example, a book on how to write Mac software, or blog posts or anything like that. They were kind of few and far between, and it changed it enormously back then. But then, of course, over the years, we're still talking like 15 years ago at this point. Over the years, it's changed multiple times again. So the gold rush kind of finished, and partly the gold rush went away and it became harder to make money, and partly people just moved on to different things. It really was a gold rush at the beginning.
Yeah, I think we can
So
all
we've seen the
remember
community.
applications like I Am Rich. Maybe it might be like the perfect example of this gold rush period.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and then of course, Swift came along, and that was another big thing, and that changed the community again. And all of these changes, they're all natural and they're all fine, and but the community does evolve over time, and people come in and they leave, and they, that's okay. That's part of what a healthy community has. Yeah.
Yeah, but definitely I agree. Also, like the experience of being an iOS developer, like when it started, I remember Objective C. It was, I don't want to say rough, but it was kind of a low-level language. You had to manually manage memory. Today, Swift is much more like beginner friendly first, so it's much easier to get started on learning, but also maybe on writing content. And forgot what I wanted to say. Yeah, I've sometimes also like heard people say that the community, at least the conferences before Swift, people were talking a lot about frameworks, how to use the API, and now people speak about Swift, the language itself, because there is so many things that we can do with the language itself, actually.
So I still have a very soft spot for Objective C. I think it's a beautiful language, and I have very, very fond memories of it. I don't use it anymore. I do. I did kind of write my last line of Objective C quite a long time ago. But one thing that is worth mentioning is that the community, and certainly what the community is outputting, is not necessarily always a real world look at the vast majority of iOS development and Mac development. So when Swift came out, very quickly, the only thing people were blogging about was Swift, because that's what's new and that's what's exciting. And it was a tremendously exciting announcement. A brand new language, and not just a kind of incremental change from Objective-C, like a fundamental change from Objective-C. And so, of course, what did people want to write about and want to talk about? They wanted to talk about Swift. And that's fine. And so, as somebody who reports on that community, the newsletter quite quickly changed to covering almost exclusively Swift. I mean, it wasn't like instant. It happened over a couple of years, but very quickly it did kind of shift fairly fundamentally. But actually, at the time, most iOS developers were still writing Objective-C. So it's tempting to look at what the community is writing about and think, well, this is what iOS development is. But actually, if you dip below the surface into people's real world applications and jobs and all the things that they're doing day to day, it moves much more slowly there.
Yeah, and I think we've also seen it with SwiftUI when it was
Yeah.
introduced. Like everyone was blogging, writing, talking about SwiftUI, but it's still the same thing, I guess. Like for the moment, the vast majority of apps are still written in UIKit, and I guess the switch is going to be made over like the next like 1 or 2 years. But yeah, like the community, it tends to like kind of like precede
one
how things happen in the industry.
1 or 2 or 5 years. Yeah.
Exactly. And Philip is saying exactly the same thing. And we have a question so from Aris. So Aris is saying, what is the best way to really stay on top of things in the Swift community? I want to be updated to the max.
Well, the first thing you should do is subscribe to iOS Dev Weekly. No, I'm kidding.
That's true. That's true.
Um, so if you want to take, well, so actually, I wasn't planning to talk about this tonight, but one of the things that I'm actually going to talk about in tomorrow's newsletter is that it's not always necessarily the best thing to do to stay absolutely at the bleeding edge of everything new that's happening. It can be very tempting to constantly look forward in terms of what's coming next. Like, what should I be learning next? I don't know about you, but I love to learn new things. It's getting a little bit harder as I get older, but I still enjoy learning new things. But it's quite tempting to just constantly be looking forward and wishing for things to be different and wishing for things to change, when actually it can be just as beneficial, more so in some ways, to really master some of the things that we have right now. And so your question of how do I keep up to date? I mean, you should keep yourself up to date. It's partly a part of being a developer is keeping yourself current with what's happening in your industry. But at the same time, my advice would be to focus on not only what's new and what's coming, but focus on what's here and what we have today, because we've got an incredible set of tools and APIs and the ability to create incredible things with what we have right now. But I think if you are looking to keep up literally with the very bleeding edge of what's going on, the set of OPML files on the iOS directory are a great way to find out literally everything that's being written about this in terms of the community. I wish Apple had an RSS feed. Actually, I wish Apple had an RSS feed of everything new that they were adding to their documentation site, for example, because that documentation site is constantly evolving and having new content published to it. There's a slightly tricky thing there is, like, do you want an RSS feed of every typo that gets fixed? Probably not. So it would need to be curated in some way by Apple, but I'd love to see them kind of really lean into making those updates public, actually.
Yeah, I think every blogger would also very much like to have such an RSS feed, because it would be like you would get like ideas for articles like coming to you for free. And I want to say I really agree about what you say about the pressure to like learn everything and you don't have to. And just to give a very concrete example on my end, the reason why there are not one single video about SwiftUI on my channel is because I actually don't know a lot about SwiftUI for the moment. Like, I know the basics, but I haven't been like digging into the topic a lot. And when I will need to, I will. But up until now, I haven't, and I'm not dead yet, and I'm still an iOS developer. So yeah, like you don't need. It's very easy to feel the constant pressure, but like sometimes just really understanding the tools that you are using today is also a very, very good thing. I definitely agree on that one.
Yeah.
And I was just looking at my notes, how the community, and maybe when you are making your newsletter, like, are you do you see that SwiftUI is really like, it has been announced so 2 years ago? Did it like spike very early in terms of article, and is it still like increasing, or has it like started to flatten like in the articles that are published?
Well, so there's a couple of things that happened with SwiftUI. First of all, like you said, that one of the things that happened was the community stopped writing about using the API. When Swift came out, the community stopped writing about so much about the APIs and building apps with the APIs, and they started writing about the language because that was what was kind of new and interesting, and people, found a real passion for learning lots of different language features and proposing language features. And the fact that Swift became open source and everything like that, it created this enormous swell of writing about the language and not about the apps. When Swift UI came out, it actually started to redress that balance a little bit, and people did start to talk about building apps again, because now the new thing that they're all excited about learning is a higher level API for building apps. It's a UI framework, So yes, it did immediately start to dominate things, just like I was talking about with Swift. Swift instantly dominated everything that was being written, while there was a whole load of still Objective-C code still being written. We're now a little bit further along, and there's much less Objective-C code being written these days. But there's still an enormous amount of UIKit code being written and AppKit code being written. And Swift UI is in a fraction of the apps in the App Store, and will be in a fraction of the apps in the App Store for a long time. One nice thing about Swift UI is the way that you don't need to start over, and you can integrate Swift UI in little bits of your application. You could do one view in Swift UI, and that would be fine. So it's a good way for that to be adopted, and that's a kind of a good note for the future, is like, you don't need to just kind of throw everything away and do everything in pure Swift UI or something like that. In fact, there's no such thing as pure Swift UI. It doesn't exist, because
And not there is some UI kit anyway. So
yeah, what do you think that text field in Swift UI is creating behind the scenes? It's so yeah, it's this kind of idea of things move slowly in the real world, but the community, they can appear to move quickly.
yeah, and that was a question. So when is the right time to learn about Swift UI? I don't know about you, Dave. Me, believe that with iOS 15, so Swift UI is iOS 30 minimum. I think that this year we will start to be able to use Swift UI, at least like you're saying, for one or two screen in apps that are in the App Store. Like the requirement will become reasonable, I would say.
I think if you've shipped Swift UI code in an application today, you're well ahead of the curve. Like, you are already ahead of the vast majority of other apps on the store. And that's okay. I think there's a difference between being aware of something and learning about something, and maybe having a little test project, or a side project or something like that has started to use Swift UI in real shipping code, but there is no rush to adopt it across the board, or like to rush into shipping Swift UI for the sake of shipping Swift UI. The applications we create that get put in the hands of the users that we have, nobody cares what it was written with. And so you might get some good feeling inside yourself from using a modern API. And at the point where you can see that it's saving you time or becoming more efficient, making your development process more efficient, that's the point at which you should start to say, well, this is actually the right technology that I should be using at this point. But focusing on like when should I start to use Swift UI it's when Swift UI makes your job easier, not harder. And if you jumped into Swift UI in year one, Swift UI made your job harder, like really a lot harder. So yeah, that would be my advice there.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Also, to keep in mind that, as you are saying, like with Swift UI, is it going to make your life easier as a developer? For bloggers, of course, Swift UI made your life easier because you had lots of ideas like coming out of nowhere. So of course, bloggers will tend to speak about a topic a lot of time before it will become like it will become like how should I say it, a good investment for a developer. There is a little like a gap between the two. So it's normal that bloggers will focus on it very heavily before like a developer should. Uh, and so to move on to the last part of this interview, so I wanted to ask you, like, with the great vantage point that you have over the community, if you had any advice on starting a project. And then in the discussion to prepare this episode, well, you reminded me that you've actually started a project recently, so the Swift Package Index. So maybe you can actually tell us a little bit about this project.
Yeah, so the Swift Package Index, the Swift Package Manager had been released, I think, was it 2015? The Package Manager was originally
I think it
introduced.
was not long after Swift, so maybe yeah,
Yeah,
when it was only for Swift for the backend, yeah. So
exactly. But for many years, it didn't really become something that an iOS developer or a macOS developer would even be able to use. In fact, you couldn't build iOS or Mac applications with Swift Package Manager at the
that's right.
beginning. But over time, it did kind of start to move towards that. And because it's open source, you can kind of see what's happening. And so with my position kind of watching over the community and seeing what's kind of going on, I started to see some things that made me think, well, I wonder if this year is the year that they'll integrate it with Xcode, or at least make it possible to build iOS applications with Swift Package Manager. And so going back to what I said right at the very beginning, which is I don't like to have kind of big ideas that I put a lot of effort behind before I know whether it's going to be successful. But I did think, well, if the package manager, eventually, surely it will be able to build iOS and Mac applications. And when that happens, because it's backed by Apple, it might become the dominant. And this was not a guaranteed thing. Like, it was at the time, CocoaPods and to a lesser extent Carthage were absolutely dominant in this area, and every single project that you came across used one of those two dependency managers. But I did think that, if Apple are backing something, they just constantly are able to then push it, and it will have like the best support within Xcode and that kind of thing. I thought, well, I wonder if there's room for somebody to create a search engine for Swift packages. And so before it was announced at WWDC, I took a risk, and I thought, okay, well, if I can create something and get it up and running so that as they announce Swift Package Manager for iOS support at the conference, I can then say, and look, here's a search engine to help you find packages that are compatible. I thought that was, worth a go. And so I worked on it and I didn't quite hit the release of the package manager. I hadn't quite got it finished by the time they announced it, but it was pretty soon afterwards that like a couple of weeks, 2-3 weeks afterwards, that I announced. At the time, it was called the Swift PM Library. And that was a site that I wrote in Ruby using Rails as a backend framework. And it would collect data about all the packages and stick it in a database, and then allow that database to be searched. And I think you've got a screenshot of
the Swift
it's up on the
PM
screen right
library.
now.
That's the right one.
Yeah. So this was the Swift PM library. This was the first iteration of it. Very basic site, but it did start to kind of prove, well, yeah, maybe there's something here. And then I actually backed off from developing that site. I had a whole load of ideas of what to do, but I thought, well, let's leave it a little bit and see how quickly Swift Package Manager adoption happens, rather than plowing years of work into something that then maybe actually didn't work out in the end. Let's take it easy, just step back, do something else for a little bit. I then got approached by a couple of people who were talking to me about maybe making like an open source version of the Swift PM library. And one of those people turned out to be, I mentioned him earlier as well, Sven Schmidt. So he originally approached me about adding a feature to my Swift PM library. He said, would you consider, integrating this feature into the product? And here's something that I've been working on that might actually help you do that. that email turned into a quick kind of audio conversation. We jumped on a call basically and chatted for half an hour. And over the next few weeks, we decided to, okay, well, let's make an open source Swift package index. And we renamed the project at the same time. And we worked quickly and we actually worked great together to build this open source. So it's written in Swift this time. It's written in Swift with Vapor. And it's now fully open source and has been open source since day one. And there it is, yeah.
So that's a screenshot of the Swift package index. Once again, I think the link is in the description, so if you want to go check it out. And so, as you said, search engine for Swift Swift packages. So I think I have another screenshot that shows, yeah, what you find, what data is available for each package, because it's true that it's indeed the missing part. With CocoaPods, you add this directory, but with SPM, actually, you don't have this directory. You have to know like the path of the Xcode expects you to know the URL of the library. You have no way to discover a library, so super interesting.
And even when, so there's a current proposal in review at the moment for Swift package registries, which are a collection of Swift packages, but there are multiple, or there can be multiple Swift package registries. So GitHub, for example, will become a Swift package registry, but GitLab also may become a Swift package registry, and you might have a package registry inside your company, or it's again, that's an open source thing that anyone can implement. The package index is one level above that and will aggregate the package registries.
So yeah, so definitely, like I must say, I have used a lot of CocoaPods in my experience. SPM, not that much, but having this centralized, we could say like source of truth, I think it's definitely a great like addition for the community, and I'm very curious to see how it will evolve over the next years.
And I think that comes back to the point we've covered this point a few times now, which is that the package manager, like Swift and like Swift UI, it's really early days for the package manager, and we know that. And Swift package index is a little bit ahead of where like it needs to be. Really, we're enjoying working on it so much that we've kind of put probably more time than we should have done in terms of working on that before we know it's going to be a success. Now, I'm still fairly confident that package manager will eventually be the primary dependency manager for Swift, but it's going to take an extremely long time for all those millions of projects that have CocoaPods in them to move across to Swift package manager. I think that's actually going to be quite a slow adoption.
Yeah, because it's such a central part of a project that you're not going to change it unless, like you said, it brings some like real benefits in terms of unlocking a feature that is like imperative for you, or you're going to save a lot of time. Otherwise, you don't do that kind of big change just for the fun of it.
Yeah.
And so, looking at the time, I see that we are right on time. So it's the end of the hour. So we can move on to the last but still important part of the episode, which is the promo part. So you've sent me a few links, and I think we've covered some of them. But of course, if you don't follow Dave on Twitter, you can definitely go follow him at Dave Verwer. You've also sent me a link to your blog, Dave, where there is a link to basically everything you're doing online and connected to iOS.
Yeah.
And
so daveverwer.com is the right place to go, because everything I do is linked from there. But then also, obviously, iOSDevWeekly.com and the SwiftPackageIndex.com are the other two projects that are most prominent in my life right now.
Of course, so definitely, if you want to keep up with iOS, you can subscribe to the newsletter. I know that we had a question earlier on how to keep ahead. I know that what I do is that I subscribe to as many newsletters as possible. This way, when the email arrives, I feel like the incentive to open it out of curiosity and to take a look like at what's inside. Um, and and of course, swiftpackageindex.com. Also, if you never check it out, you can check it out. And even though you might not be using SPM for the moment, if you have some idea of what it is, it might only come in handy for the future. For me, the promo will be really short. Just to remind you that you are on my YouTube channel. If you've discovered this channel through this live, well, you can do a lot of cool stuff, including subscribing, and you can also check out the content. I have some content to help you learn about iOS. So maybe go check it out. And well, to conclude the episode, I want to say first, thank you, Dave, for being with us this evening.
Thank you, Vincent, for having me on. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Awesome. I can only hope that we can do the same thing for the 1000th issue of iOS Dev Weekly. In 10 years, we will see how things will have gotten in that time.
Maybe. I'll give you a maybe on that one.
We'll see where we are in 10
Yeah.
years. And well, thank you also in the audience for attending and for asking questions. It was a great episode, always super fun to do. Best thing to say is thank you for watching and see you next time.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.